Teddy Roosevelt was the president who continued reading a speech after being shot in 1912. The famous American Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was the greatest hero of the Spanish-American War of 1898, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and inspired the teddy bear toy. One day, he got into a bar fight when a cowboy started shooting wildly, startling the patrons. The cowboy called Roosevelt Four Eyes, alluding to his famous glasses, and followed Teddy with his pistols. Roosevelt punched him in the jaw with both fists. The cowboy's pistols went off, and he was knocked unconscious by a blow against the counter. Another time, Roosevelt's boat was stolen. He and his friends built a new boat in 3 days to pursue the thieves. They chased them along the river in temperatures down to 0 degrees. When they caught the thieves, Roosevelt took the men prisoner and brought them back to be arrested. On the return trip, he reportedly read poetry to the dangerous bandits to pass the time. Roosevelt was elected U.S. Vice President in 1901. Only 6 months later, he became the 26th president after the incumbent President William McKinley was assassinated. McKinley was shot twice by the Polish-American anarchist Leon Czolgosz. At 42, Roosevelt became the youngest U.S. president in history. When the U.S. president refused to shoot a bear cub on a hunting trip in 1902, a toy manufacturer named a stuffed bear after Roosevelt. Soon, the teddy bear swept the American nation. Roosevelt was also a mixed martial arts fighter in jiu-jitsu, judo, and boxing. He loved boxing and continued to practice it in the White House. He frequently challenged professional boxers to hit him in the jaw with full force, and did not hesitate to hit back. One day, Roosevelt challenged Dan Tyler, who was a military aide at the White House, and fought against Roosevelt in the White House gym. Roosevelt demanded a fight. During the bout, a heavy punch landed on Roosevelt's left eye, damaging blood vessels and leaving him blind in that eye. Afterward, he continued to fight in jiu-jitsu and judo. Roosevelt was successfully re-elected for a second presidential term in 1904 and served until 1909. As a trustbuster, he decided not to run again because he felt it was time for a younger man to take over. However, by the 1912 presidential election, he was disillusioned with the leadership of his party, the Republicans. He ran as a presidential candidate for the newly founded Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. It got its nickname because Roosevelt often described himself as someone with the strength and vitality of a bull moose. His candidacy for a third presidential term was considered controversial, as he wanted to break the American tradition of term limits. While campaigning for re-election in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Roosevelt narrowly escaped McKinley's fate. Just before Roosevelt was about to give a speech, the Bavarian-born saloon owner John Flamengschrank tried to shoot him with a revolver. The bullet hit Roosevelt in the chest, but his life was saved because it was significantly slowed down by his heavy overcoat, the steel, reinforced glasses case in his breast pocket, and the 50-page copy of his speech before it lodged in his chest. The crowd screamed in panic, but Elbert Martin, the president's secretary and a former football player, jumped out of his car and threw Schrank to the ground. Soon, former Rough Riders, bodyguards, and policemen were on the assassin and began to beat him. Roosevelt stumbled, caught himself, and calmed the crowd with a beaming smile. He said to his assistant Harry, "He got me." The crowd demanded blood and that Schrank be killed. Only Roosevelt remained calm and shouted not to hurt him. "Bring him here. I want to see him." Roosevelt then asked the shooter, "Why did you do it?" When no answer came, he said, "Oh, what's the use? Hand him over to the police." When he felt the bullet hole in his chest, Roosevelt coughed 3 times. As an experienced hunter and anatomist, he concluded that the lack of bloody froth meant the bullet had missed his lung. Believing he was not seriously injured, Roosevelt insisted on delivering his speech. The speech lasted 84 minutes. Despite the blood clearly visibly staining his shirt, he opened his speech with, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." After his speech, he allowed himself to be taken to the hospital, where doctors decided not to remove the bullet. Instead, it remained lodged in his chest muscles for the rest of his life. Schrank, the would-be assassin, later claimed that the ghost of former President McKinley had instructed him in a dream to kill Roosevelt. Roosevelt recovered quickly, but failed to win re-election as president. Afterward, he devoted much time to working as an explorer and successful author. He died in his sleep of a blood clot on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60. Schrank was declared legally insane at his trial and spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution. He died in 1943 at the age of 67 from bronchitis. George H.E.W. Bush was the president who narrowly escaped being eaten by cannibals in World War II. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last U.S. president to have served in combat. Some of his predecessors had also paid their debt to the country, but George Bush's experience was unique. He managed to escape the gruesome death of being eaten by Japanese soldiers. When the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, George Bush was a 17-year-old teenager. He was attending his final year at the Phillips Academy, a university preparatory school in Andover, Massachusetts. In the days following the attack, a wave of patriotism swept through the United States of America. Young Bush also wanted to enlist as quickly as possible to serve his country. Despite being underage, he initially wanted to enlist in Canada, but then decided to serve as an aviator in the U.S. Armed Forces. After his graduation, George Bush enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve on his 18th birthday, June 12, 1942. A year after joining the Navy, he was commissioned as an ensign. He thought at the time he was the youngest pilot in the United States of America. He was only 19 years old. In the spring of 1944, he was assigned as a pilot to the light aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto. He arrived in time to participate in the campaign against Japanese-occupied islands in the Pacific. Despite his youth, George Bush became an experienced pilot following the battles over Marcus and Wake Island. He also took part in one of the largest air battles of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944. On the last day of the battle, Bush had to make a forced water landing after returning from a mission. It was his first crash in the war. Fortunately, the destroyer USS Clarence K. Bronson rescued him and his crew. The second crash, however, was much more dramatic. As the American forces in the Pacific advanced northward, they began a campaign in the Bonin Islands in August 1944. It was the same month George Herbert Walker Bush was promoted to lieutenant junior grade. On September 2, 1944, Bush was ordered to fly to Chichijima with 3 other bombers. Their mission was to destroy a vital radio tower on the island. As soon as they appeared in the sky over the island, they were engaged by intense anti-aircraft fire. Bush's plane was hit as he went into a dive on the target. Although his plane was on fire and the cockpit was full of smoke, Bush continued the dive until he saw that the bombs had hit and damaged the radio tower. Only then did he steer his burning plane toward the USS San Jacinto. Far enough from the island, Bush and another crew member bailed out of the plane. Bush watched as he descended, seeing his plane hit the water and sink into the waves. When he hit the water, his struggle began. With a soaked flight suit, injured with a head wound, and eyes burning from the smoke in the cockpit, Bush fought to stay afloat. Luckily, he landed near a life raft. When he grabbed it, he inflated it and climbed aboard. The misfortune was that the wind pushed him closer to the Japanese-held island. so Bush had to paddle with his arms to stay as far away as possible. He was spotted once by the Japanese, who tried to capture him with boats, but American fighter planes fought them off. George drifted in his raft for 4 hours, while fighter planes flew overhead to protect him. Finally, he was rescued by the rescue submarine USS Finback. Other aviators were shot down and bailed out but had less luck. The 8 captured aviators suffered severe torture by the Japanese squadron on the island. They were beaten or stabbed with sharp bamboo sticks and killed. The worst part was that 4 of the bodies were used to serve a meal to the Japanese officers. On the orders of Major Suyo Motoba, the Japanese surgeon Dr. Suyo Teraki removed the liver of one of the fallen U.S. soldiers and handed it to the cook. He marinated it with soy sauce and vegetables, cut it into small pieces, and skewered them on bamboo sticks. Major Motoba, accompanied by other officers and the commander of the island, General Yoshio Tachibana, feasted on this gruesome meal with sake. They thought it would be a good stomach remedy. The celebration was repeated with the remains of 3 other aviators. At the time, Bush knew nothing of this highly classified crime. Although the perpetrators were finally put on trial in 1946, it was not until 2003, with the publication of the book, Flyboys, A True Story of Courage, that George Herbert Walker Bush and the public learned of the horrific fate of the captured aviators. In November 1944, Bush returned to the USS San Jacinto and continued to fight over the Philippines. After a few months, his unit returned to the United States of America due to heavy casualties, and in September 1945, George Herbert Walker Bush was honorably discharged from service. Although he flew 58 combat missions, had 126 carrier landings, and completed 228 flight hours, the mission over the island of Chichijima was the one that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. As he later said, these were the moments he remembered for the rest of his life. The Watergate scandal occurred between 1972 and late 1973. There was a series of mysterious meetings in an underground parking garage near Washington between the Washington Post journalist Bob Woodward and a mysterious anonymous informant known as Deep Throat. He shockingly revealed that the recent break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate Hotel, an office building, was not a simple burglary, but politically motivated. It got worse when it emerged that the break-in was supported by the then administration of the White House under President Nixon. Apparently, he wanted to gather material for his re-election campaign later in the year by collecting information and planting bugs at the Democratic headquarters. Toward the end of his first term, President Nixon had become desperate and paranoid as he tried to secure his presidency. Among his many problems was the negotiated withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam, a protracted and now highly unpopular war. Nixon's campaign promise of peace was very popular with the American people, who, after returning from the brink of nuclear war a decade earlier, were now experiencing a period of detente. This de-escalation of hostilities between the United States of America saw President Nixon himself making a diplomatic visit to China in early 1972 to discuss trade, among other things. With a strong position before the election, Nixon denied any involvement in the Watergate scandal, and the public believed him. On November 7, 1972, Nixon was elected President of the United States of America in a landslide victory. Despite everything, the allegations regarding Watergate persisted. Soon it became known that Nixon and other high-ranking Republicans were allegedly funding a covert group for secret operations. Their activities included accessing private mail, extensive telephone wiretapping, and burglaries for information gathering. It was suspected that this information would be used to overthrow or blackmail political opponents. Despite growing evidence, Nixon continued to deny any knowledge of or involvement in these illegal activities, while his administration desperately looked for ways behind the scenes to distance itself from the situation. The situation worsened when it was revealed that, in an embarrassing twist, Nixon had to pay nearly $500,000 in back taxes. This damaging report dealt another blow to Nixon's public image as trust in the president began to crumble. Throughout 1973, the presidency was under pressure from the Senate Watergate Committee, a special division investigating the Watergate break-in and all other espionage activities related to the 1972 election campaign. The committee was allowed to hold judicial proceedings, with hearings and testimonies from Nixon's closest advisors, which were broadcast nationwide on TV during the summer. During the Watergate hearings, one of the most crucial moments of the investigation took place. Under questioning, Deputy Assistant to the President Alexander Butterfield was reluctantly forced to reveal the existence of the infamous White House tapes. The tapes were part of a new recording system that automatically recorded conversations in the Oval Office and other private locations in the White House. Faced with the incriminating evidence the committee needed, Nixon did everything he could in the second half of 1973 to block the release of the tapes and the entire investigation. Nixon refused to hand over the tapes requested by Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, invoking his presidential right of executive privilege. When Cox continued to insist on exposing the president, Nixon ordered his Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the inconvenient prosecutor. Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus refused the order and resigned in protest. Although Cox was eventually removed by Solicitor General Robert Bork, his departure, along with that of two of the nation's leading legal figures, became infamously known as the Saturday Night Massacre. These developments led to public protests and demands for impeachment proceedings against the president. By November 1973, the situation for Nixon was so precarious that during a televised Q&A session at Disney World's Contemporary Resort, he felt compelled to declare, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I am not a crook." By early 1974, Nixon's defense had almost entirely collapsed. In March, several close aides and advisors to the president were formally indicted for perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. In a last desperate attempt, the administration agreed to the release of an edited version of the White House tapes transcripts. The contents of the transcripts eliminated the last remnants of support for Nixon. However, investigators pushed for a full release of the audio tapes. In July, Nixon lost a case before the Supreme Court, making the White House tapes public. The uncut tapes linked Nixon directly to the Watergate break-in and other espionage actions surrounding the 1972 election campaign. Following the Republican Party's abandonment, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency on August 9, 1974, rather than face impeachment. Nixon then retired from politics in disgrace. His reputation was ruined. However, before charges could be brought against him, Nixon was controversially granted a full pardon by President Gerald Ford. Nixon would never hold political office again. Instead, he devoted the rest of his life to writing and international affairs. During this time, he traveled extensively abroad to visit various governments. In 1977, Nixon conducted a revealing interview with British journalist David Frost, in which he attempted to explain his case to the American people. In the United States of America, the interview was received with mixed feelings. Some criticized Nixon for attempting to salvage his reputation, while others saw it as a sincere apology. In the end, Nixon's more positive achievements on the world stage were allowed to shine through, and he died in 1994 as a respected statesman. alongside President Bill Clinton and former U.S. officials. Former presidents George Bush Sr., Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and Gerald Ford were in attendance. The identity of the mysterious informant Deep Throat was not revealed until 2005, over 30 years later. It was former FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt. He stated that he leaked the information at the time because it was his moral duty to point out the shady dealings under Nixon. The assassination of John F. Kennedy happened on Friday, November 26, 1963. John F. Kennedy served as president at the height of the Cold War. During his presidency, he increased military spending for nuclear and conventional forces, as well as the number of U.S. advisors in Vietnam, from 400 to 16,000. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, in which 400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles failed in their invasion of their homeland, occurred at the beginning of his presidency. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to the USSR and the United States of America signing the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Furthermore, the hotline, a direct telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin, was established. Under Kennedy, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall to stop East German citizens from fleeing to the Federal Republic of Germany. In a speech in Berlin, he stood against Soviet oppression and gave the citizens hope. But in the winter of 1963, John F. Kennedy's presidency tragically came to an abrupt end. On November 21, 1963, Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline departed on Air Force One for a two-day, five-city tour of Texas. He wanted to announce his candidacy for the 1964 presidential election in Texas, as the state was crucial for his re-election. The Texans needed to be convinced, since the state largely disagreed with Kennedy's civil rights policies and his handling of foreign policy, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Disputes among Democratic Party leaders there also hindered his re-election chances, which needed to be overcome. The next morning, on November 22, Kennedy gave a speech to a large crowd outside the hotel where he had stayed in Fort Worth, and then gave another speech inside at a breakfast hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce. In his final speech, he would say, "This is a very dangerous and uncertain world. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it." The presidential party left the Texas hotel and drove in a motorcade to Carswell Air Force Base, boarded Air Force One, and landed a short time later at Love Field Airport in Dallas. President Kennedy and his wife greeted the enthusiastic crowd from the back seats of their limousine in the motorcade. The Democratic governor of Texas, John Connally, and his wife sat in front of them. In front of those seats were two Secret Service agents. The president's next stop was the Dallas Trade Mart, 10 miles away, where Kennedy was scheduled to give another speech. An estimated 200,000 people lined the route to the Trade Mart. The president rode in an open four-door 1961 Lincoln Continental limousine, designated by the Secret Service as SS-100X. The motorcade drove through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. Nellie Connally, the First Lady of Texas, turned to the president, who was sitting behind her, and remarked, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." To which President Kennedy agreed, saying, "No, you certainly can't." Those were the last words ever spoken by John F. Kennedy. At 12:30 p.m., the motorcade drove past the grassy knoll north of Elm Street toward the Texas School Book Depository. Then shots were heard. One bullet struck President Kennedy's neck and Governor Connally's shoulder and wrist. A second shot struck President Kennedy in the head, covering the rear interior of the limousine with fragments of skull, blood, and brain matter. The impact was so violent that blood and fragments even landed on the Secret Service car driving behind them. The limousine sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital in minutes, but it was too late, and the doctors could do nothing more. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 100 p.m. Connally would recover from his injuries. The country and the world were shocked. President Kennedy's body was taken from Parkland Hospital to Love Field and loaded onto Air Force One. At 2:38 p.m., protected aboard Air Force One in case of further assassination attempts, Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy by his side in her blood, spattered clothes. U.S. District Judge Sarah Hughes administered the oath. Less than an hour ago, the police had arrested a suspect. Witnesses reported shots from various directions, but several mentioned the window in the southeast corner on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. Only 2 employees of the building were missing, one who was prevented by police from entering during the shooting, and Lee Harvey Oswald, who had only been working there for a month. Witnesses had seen him in the 6th floor window and described him, prompting the police to issue a description. While descending, he encountered Dallas police officer Marion L. Baker, who drew his weapon. However, he was allowed to pass because Oswald's supervisor identified him as an employee. After the shots, Oswald fled the book depository, traveling several blocks on foot, by bus, and by taxi to his boarding house. There he grabbed a pistol and a jacket and began wandering aimlessly. Oswald left the scene at 12:33 p.m. and took a bus to his boarding house. The police found a rifle under boxes and its shell casings at the 6th floor window, as described by witnesses. The police initially identified it as a 7.65 Mauser, but later the FBI clarified that it was actually an Italian Carcano M9 138 bolt-action rifle. The used Italian Carcano rifle had been purchased earlier in the year by Oswald under the alias Alec J. Huddell. The Carcano was a notoriously inaccurate weapon. Despite Oswald's previous military training, many find it hard to believe that he could hit a moving target like the president twice so accurately from about 250 feet away with this weapon. Shortly thereafter, a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit was patrolling his district and saw a man matching Oswald's description at the corner of 10th Street and Patton Avenue. After a brief exchange of words, Oswald shot Tippit 4 times with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him in front of witnesses. Oswald ran to the nearby Commercial Street, Jefferson Boulevard. Johnny Calvin Brewer noticed Oswald's suspicious behavior and followed him several blocks to the Texas Theater. Oswald sneaked in there without buying a ticket. Brewer signaled to police officer Nick McDonald, who entered the theater with a colleague. Both officers arrested Oswald on the stage of the Texas Theater, 6 blocks from the crime scene, at 1:50 p.m. When Oswald was arrested, he was carrying a fake ID with the name Alec J. Huddell, the pseudonym he used to purchase the rifle. Texas law, however, did not require background checks for gun purchases. There was no reason to buy it under a false name. Oswald bought a rifle and a pistol under a false name by mail. The reasons for this remain unclear. Strangely, it was known that Army intelligence had a file on him, but its contents were destroyed before investigators could obtain it. On November 24, a Sunday morning, after 2 nights in custody, Oswald was transferred from the city jail to the county jail. The event was broadcast live on television to millions of Americans. Suddenly, a man shot Oswald at close range. He died 2 hours later at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, fired the pistol. He claimed he murdered Oswald to spare Mrs. Kennedy a return to Dallas for the trial. The memorial service for President Kennedy on November 25, 1963, was attended by representatives from over 100 countries and watched by millions on TV. On November 29, 1963, President Lyndon Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, also known as the Warren Commission, named after its chairman, Chief Justice of the United States Earl Warren. The 88-page final report was submitted to Johnson on September 24, 1964. The Warren Report concluded that Oswald, an experienced marksman, fired 3 shots. One passed through Kennedy's neck and struck Connally. One fatally struck Kennedy in the back of the head, and one missed the president but ricocheted off the pavement and injured James Tague. Many doubted the findings, claiming there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza. Witnesses believed they heard shots coming from a railroad yard beyond the knoll. However, the report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby had acted alone. Although the findings of the Warren Commission remain controversial, Air Force One from 1953 to today is the call sign for any U.S. Air Force aircraft carrying the U.S. president. When the president travels on a Marine helicopter, its call sign is Marine One. If the president takes a commercial flight on rare occasions, his aircraft is always designated as Executive One. Air Force Two is the call sign for any aircraft carrying the vice president. For security reasons, the president and vice president never fly together. The first specially modified presidential aircraft was a propeller-driven C-54 Skymaster in 1945. It was called the Sacred Cow. It had an additional sleeping area, enhanced communication equipment, and a retractable elevator for President Roosevelt and his wheelchair. The need for a unique call sign for the president arose in 1953 when President Eisenhower's plane and an Eastern Airlines flight came dangerously close due to similar call signs. Since the late 1950s, the president has had a fleet of specially modified aircraft, often called the Presidential Fleet. Over the years, the fleet has utilized the massive propeller-driven Lockheed Constellation, Boeing's first jetliner, the 707, and since 1990, the popular Boeing 747. Originally, it offered the president safe and flexible air transport. Over time, it evolved into a flying crisis center and command center for nuclear warfare. The iconic blue and white livery of the presidential aircraft was introduced in the early 1960s by President Kennedy, as he felt the previous black and red nose was too regal. So he commissioned the American designer, Raymond Loewy, to design something he considered modern and used the font style of the American Declaration of Independence to write the words, United States of America, along the length of the main body. He added the presidential seal to the nose and a large U.S. flag to the tail. The current aircraft are heavily modified Boeing 747s. Through aerial refueling, they can remain airborne for very long periods. There is a presidential suite, an office, a conference room, a dining room, meeting rooms for senior staff, a medical room, and quarters for staff, guests, press, security, and the Secret Service. The aircraft possesses state-of-the-art security systems, such as electronic countermeasures for radar jamming and flares on the wings against heat-seeking missiles. The wiring is 240 miles long and heavily shielded to protect the aircraft in the event of a nuclear electromagnetic pulse. The reinforced fuselage and armored windows can withstand a nuclear explosion from the ground. Other features are classified, but despite constant updates, these aircraft are now becoming expensive to operate. In the coming years, they are to be replaced by a new Boeing 747 variant, the VC-25B aircraft, under a fixed-price contract of $3.9 billion. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and like if you enjoyed it. See you soon.